That night, the stew burned. I had been told to watch it, and when the smell turned bitter, my father's voice thundered from the dining room before he even saw the pot. He stormed in, eyes blazing, and without thinking, he grabbed the pot and slammed it into the sink. The stew splashed up my arm, hot enough to sting. I flinched, not from the pain, but from the look in his eyes. He said my name like it was something rotten. My mother came in, her tone calm, almost practiced. "She's just careless, Jack," she said, wiping the counter. Daniel snickered from the doorway. I stood still, stew dripping onto the floor, wishing I could disappear into the cracks of that old wooden house. The next morning, I found my place at the breakfast table already taken. My brother had spread his books over my seat. When I tried to sit beside him, my father gestured toward the far end, where the stool stood by the window. "You can eat there," he said. "You're always looking out anyway." I obeyed. Outside, frost had painted the glass, and my reflection wavered between the white branches and my mother's cold silhouette behind me. That stool became my corner, my exile inside my own home. I learned early how favoritism rots love from the inside. Daniel was the golden boy, with his trophies and his wide grin that mirrored my father's youth. When I brought home good grades, my mother smiled politely but said nothing. When Daniel scored a touchdown, she baked pies for the neighbors. The imbalance wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, like water carving stone. Every praise for him felt like a subtraction from me. By 17, I had grown tired of that subtraction. I wanted to become an architect to build something beautiful and lasting, something that didn't collapse like our dinner conversations. My art teacher had written a recommendation letter, her words glowing with belief in me. I still remember the paper trembling in my hands as I showed it to my parents. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. My mother said, "Architecture? That's not for a girl. You'll marry, have children. That's enough building for one life." That night, I stayed awake at my desk, tracing blueprints I'd drawn from old magazines. The sound of my brother's laughter drifted down the hallway. I could almost hear the clinking of his trophies against the shelf, the same sound that once filled me with envy, and now only echoed like a taunt. I promised myself I would leave, no matter what it cost. Then came the scholarship letter. Full tuition, out of state. The dream I had built in silence suddenly had a door out of that house. I ran to show them, my heart pounding like it might leap free from my ribs. My mother read it once, her face blank. My father read it twice, slower, then folded it neatly and set it on the table. "You're not going," he said simply. "We're not sending a daughter to live alone in another city." "I don't need you to send me," I said, the words trembling but clear. "It's paid for. Everything." He looked up, eyes narrowing. "If you walk out that door, don't come back." My mother's silence sealed the sentence. She looked at her hands, twisting her wedding ring, as if it were someone else's life between her fingers. I remember the exact second my heart cracked, not from his words, but from how little they seemed to hurt him to say them. I packed that night, one suitcase and my sketchbook, and left while they slept. The moon hung low, like a cold witness, as I stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my boots. For a moment, I thought I heard my mother's voice call after me, but it was only the wind scraping across the fields. Halfway down the road, the rain began. It soaked through my jacket, turned the dirt to mud, but I didn't stop. My scholarship letter was folded in my coat pocket, the ink already bleeding, but I held it close like a relic. The farmhouse faded behind me until it was just a blur of dim light and smoke, swallowed by the storm. When the bus pulled away from town that dawn, I looked out the window and watched the fields stretch endlessly, gray and ghostly. I thought about the sound of my father's fork, the cold stew, the empty stool by the window. I realized I had never truly belonged there. That realization didn't hurt as much as it should have, it just hollowed me out, leaving space for something else to grow. I turned my sketchbook to a blank page and drew the outline of a house, not the one I left behind, but the one I would build someday. Strong beams, wide windows, rooms filled with light. I didn't know it then, but 30 years later, that drawing would become real, and the people who had shut me out would one day line up at its gates, waiting to be let in. The first weeks after leaving home felt like floating between two worlds. The bus had dropped me in a small college town that smelled of wet asphalt and pine trees, and for the first time in my life, no one knew my name. Freedom was supposed to feel bright and vast, but to me, it felt like an open wound. I slept in a shared dorm room with peeling paint and humming pipes, my suitcase tucked under the bed like a reminder of where I'd come from. I ate from vending machines, counted coins before every purchase, and tried to keep the fear from crawling too close to my dreams. Architecture school was nothing like the glossy photos in the brochures. It was sleepless nights, ink-stained hands, and sketches that never looked good enough. But I loved it. I loved the lines, the angles, the way a single curve could change the soul of a space. I felt alive in a way I never had before, as if the drafts I made on paper were blueprints for my own survival. Each structure I designed carried a piece of the life I wanted, something symmetrical, safe, and full of light. Sometimes, after midnight, I'd walk across the campus lawns under the orange glow of the streetlights and imagine calling home. I'd picture my mother answering, her voice uncertain but soft, asking if I was eating well. I'd imagine my father saying he was proud, even if it came out as a grunt. But when I reached for the payphone, I always stopped myself. Their silence had become its own kind of language. It said everything words couldn't. Months passed. I took on a part-time job at a cafe, serving lattes to people who wore clean clothes and easy smiles. Every paycheck went straight to my rent. My classmates went home for Thanksgiving, but I stayed behind, drawing alone in the quiet studio, while snow piled against the windows. My fingers cracked from the cold, but I kept sketching. I couldn't afford to stop, not when the dream was all I had left of myself. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived in the mailroom with my mother's handwriting on the envelope. My chest tightened as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The words were short. "Your father is willing to help with tuition next semester. Don't waste it." It wasn't affection, but it was something. I held on to it like a fragile bridge, believing maybe the ice between us could thaw. A few weeks later, a check came, signed by my father. I stared at the numbers enough to cover the tuition I'd been terrified of losing. I wrote a thank you letter, long and careful, telling them about my progress, my professors, the design competition I planned to enter. I mailed it the same day and waited for a reply that never came. But I told myself it didn't matter. The gesture was enough. Maybe love could exist in small, practical ways. The semester that followed was the hardest yet. I entered the regional design competition, staying up for days to perfect my model, a riverside home that blended wood, glass, and silence. It wasn't just a house, it was an apology to the child I used to be. When I presented it to the judges, my voice shook but my heart was steady. Weeks later, I got the call I'd won. It wasn't a grand victory, but for me, it was everything. The prize money would pay for my next year. My photo appeared in the local paper, and for the first time, I felt seen. That night, I called home. My hands trembled as the phone rang. My mother answered, her tone cautious, as though she'd picked up a wrong number. "It's me," I said quietly. "I just wanted to tell you I won an award." There was a pause, a sound like the shifting of a chair. "That's nice," she said. "Daniel's getting married next month." I stood there, frozen, as if someone had pulled the ground out from under me. I forced a smile into my voice. "Tell him I said congratulations." "Duh." She hesitated before hanging up. "Be careful with the money you win," she added. "It comes and goes." That night, I sat by the dorm window, watching the snow fall under the streetlight. The flakes caught the light and melted against the glass, sliding down like slow tears. I realized something then. Every time I reached for them, they gave me just enough to keep me hoping, but never enough to let me rest. Love, in my family, was a currency with no return. Still, I kept chasing the dream. I interned at a small architecture firm during summer, sketching layouts for houses I'd never live in. The owner, Mr. Phelps, was a patient man who taught me the value of proportion, balance, and silence in design. "Every building tells a story," he said once, leaning over my drawing. "The walls are memory, the windows are forgiveness. You'll understand one day." I wanted to believe I already did. Yet when I returned to my dorm after work, I'd open my mailbox and find it empty. I sent letters home every few months, updates, photos, even small gifts when I could afford them, but they went unanswered. The silence grew louder, turning into a hum at the back of my mind. Then, just before graduation, another envelope arrived. This time, it wasn't a letter, it was a bank statement. My account had been emptied. The scholarship deposit, the competition prize, every cent I'd saved gone. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, scanning the withdrawals. Each transaction led back to one account, one signature, my father's. I didn't understand at first. My tuition had been paid directly through that joint account, the same one I'd opened when I was still a minor, under his supervision. He'd never closed his access. The realization hit like a collapsing wall. The tuition check he'd sent me months ago had been his way back into my finances. He hadn't helped me. He'd planted the key to my undoing. I called home in disbelief, but no one answered. I left messages, sent letters, pleaded for explanation. Silence answered back. When I finally reached my mother weeks later, her voice was calm, detached. "Your father needed the money," she said. "The farm's been hard. He thought you'd understand." "I understand," I said, my voice hollow. "I just didn't think I'd lose everything to the people who said they loved me." She didn't reply. The line went dead. That night, I packed my few belongings again. The dorm was dark and quiet. My reflection in the window looked older than my 22 years. I told myself I would rebuild. I always had. But deep inside, something cracked open and began to bleed differently, quieter, colder. As I stepped out into the night, the air smelled of rain again, the same as it had the night I left home. It was as if life had looped back to remind me. Promises made in that house were meant to be broken. For months after my father emptied my account, I lived in a blur of motion. I took whatever jobs I could find, waiting tables, sketching logo designs, even cleaning offices after midnight. My hands were always trembling from exhaustion, but they never stopped drawing. The paper was my last sanctuary, the only place where no one could steal from me. By day, I wore a polite smile. By night, I built the bones of a future that no one believed I deserved. Eventually, I found work at a small architectural studio in the city, a space with cracked windows and dreams far bigger than its rent. The owner, a kind woman named Martha Green, hired me as an assistant. She was in her 40s, pragmatic but gentle, the kind of person who saw potential in others even when they couldn't see it in themselves. "You've got raw vision," she told me one morning, handing back a sketch. "Rough edges, but there's something honest in your lines. That can't be taught." Oh. I didn't know how to respond. Compliments had always sounded foreign to me, so I just nodded and got back to work. Under Martha's guidance, I learned more than any textbook could have taught me. She believed in clean geometry, in the poetry of balance. But what I learned most from her wasn't architecture, it was trust. She'd leave the office keys with me, knowing I'd stay late to perfect drafts no one had asked for. I began to breathe again, slowly, like someone recovering from near drowning. One autumn evening, as the city turned gold and rust, Martha invited me to join a client meeting for a new community library project. It was the first time I'd be allowed to present my designs publicly. I wore my best thrift store blazer, ironed twice, and carried my portfolio like it contained my pulse. The room was filled with men in tailored suits, their voices smooth and confident. I was the youngest, and the only woman. When I unrolled my drawings, the room fell quiet, not with admiration yet, but curiosity. My hands didn't shake this time. I spoke softly, explaining my design's flow of light, the quiet alcoves for solitude, the open arches for connection. When I finished, one of the investors leaned back and said, "There's something haunting about it, in a good way." Martha smiled. "That's her touch," she said. "She builds silence like it's a material." That night, walking home, I could feel the city breathing with me. For the first time, success didn't feel like an accident, it felt earned. I passed the glowing shop windows and caught my reflection among them. Older, steadier, a little proud. I wanted to share that moment with someone. Without thinking, I called home again. My mother answered after a long pause. Her voice was thin, uncertain. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, "I got promoted. My design was chosen for a library project." "That's nice," she said quietly. "Your brother's business is doing well too. He just bought a new truck." It was the same pattern, the same small sting wrapped in ordinary words. "That's great for him," I said, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "I just wanted you to know I'm okay." "No?" "Of course you are," she said, almost dismissively. "You always land on your feet." Then came the faint background sound of laughter, Daniel's laughter. The line cut before I could respond. For days afterward, I tried to ignore the ache that followed. I poured it into my work instead. The library project gained attention, and local media wrote a feature about a promising young architect with a story of resilience. My photo appeared beside Martha's. She framed the article and hung it in the studio. Clients began to call, new opportunities opened, and suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. But recognition has a way of stirring old ghosts. A week after the article ran, an email arrived from my brother. The subject line was simple. "Proud of you." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Saw the paper. "You've done well for yourself. Mom and Dad mentioned you the other night. Maybe it's time you came home, even just for a visit." The message ended with his phone number, followed by a single line that made my stomach twist. Dad's been telling people you owe your success to the discipline he taught you. I sat there in the studio after everyone left, staring at the glow of the computer screen. The words blurred, replaced by memories, the dinner table, the stew, the slap of cold silence, discipline. That was what he called it. I closed the laptop, feeling the old anger crawl up from the dark place where I'd buried it. Still, a part of me, stubborn, lonely, wanted to believe this could be a bridge, not a trap. So I went home for Christmas. It had been nearly 6 years since I'd left. The farm looked smaller than I remembered, the paint chipped, the air thick with hay and regret. My mother hugged me stiffly, as if testing the texture of my forgiveness. My father's hair had grayed, but his eyes hadn't softened. Daniel's house sat across the field now, larger, newer, bright, with holiday lights that looked like mockery. At dinner, they praised Daniel's successes, first his company, his wife, the baby on the way. Then, almost as an afterthought, my mother said, "And of course, Evelyn's doing well in the city." My father nodded, carving his meat. "She should be grateful. We raised her with work ethic." The words landed heavy. I kept my voice even. "You taught me survival, not work ethic." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the tablecloth. Daniel laughed softly, pouring himself more wine. "Still dramatic, huh? Some things never change." Later that night, I walked outside, letting the cold bite through my coat. The sky was clear, stars scattered across it like unfinished sketches. From the window, I could see my family sitting in the warm light, their faces blurred by glass and distance. For a moment, I thought I saw my father glance toward me, but maybe it was just my reflection in the window. When I returned to the city after the holidays, I threw myself into work harder than ever. My projects grew, my clients expanded, and slowly, the studio's name began to carry weight. Martha made me a partner within 2 years. We opened a new office downtown, sunlight pouring through tall glass walls, the kind of light I used to dream of as a girl sitting by that cold kitchen window. But even success has a shadow. My family began to appear in small ways, Daniel calling to borrow money for a new venture, my mother asking for help fixing the roof. I sent what I could at first, thinking maybe generosity could mend what time couldn't. But with each favor, the silence that followed grew heavier, guiltier. When I visited one summer, I found out Daniel had told people in town that I was investing in his business. He'd used my name to secure loans. Something inside me went still. I realized then that the old game had never ended, it had only changed its rules. They celebrated me because they'd found new ways to feed on me. Behind every praise was calculation. Behind every thank you was a hand waiting for more. As I drove back to the city that evening, the sunset burned orange against the horizon, washing the road in gold. I rolled down the window, letting the air hit my face. It should have felt like freedom, but all I could think about was how softly betrayal moves, how it never announces itself, how it begins with love, then expectation, then silence. By the time I turned 29, everything I had once dreamed of was finally within reach. Our firm, Green & Hale Studio, had just won an international competition to design a sustainable housing complex outside Chicago. The project would change everything: visibility, funding, reputation. My name was suddenly in magazines and interviews. People began to call me the youngest lead architect in the city's history. Martha was radiant with pride. "You've built something from ashes," she said one evening, raising her glass of red wine across the conference table. "Never let anyone take it away from you." Her words sounded like both a celebration and a warning. I didn't understand the warning until much later. Success attracted light, but light always cast shadows, and my family's shadows began to move closer. It started small. Daniel asking if I could sponsor his construction company as a subcontractor for our new housing project. "We'd keep it all in the family," he said over the phone, his voice dripping with charm I hadn't heard since childhood. "You'd get a trusted partner, I'd get a big opportunity. Win-win." Martha hesitated when I mentioned it. "Family and business," she said carefully, "rarely mix well." But I was tired of holding on to bitterness. I wanted to believe people could change. So, against her quiet advice, I agreed. I drafted the contract myself, clean, professional, clear. Daniel signed with a grin that reminded me too much of our father. For a few months, everything seemed fine. His team handled a small portion of the construction work, while I focused on the design phases. We met weekly to discuss progress. I even started to think maybe this was how healing began, through shared goals instead of shared pain. But then, the invoices started piling up. Costs didn't add up, payments went missing. Suppliers called asking why they hadn't been paid. I checked the ledgers line by line, and what I saw made my stomach turn. forged signatures, duplicated bills, and withdrawals in my name. I called Daniel immediately. "Must be some accounting mix-up," he said, his tone too casual. "Let me talk to my guys." Days turned into weeks, and the numbers grew worse. When I confronted him again, he laughed. "Come on, Eve, you've got plenty. Why act like a few thousand matters to you now?" My hands trembled. "You used my name." He shrugged. "You're my sister. Family shares things." I didn't know that while I was still trying to reason with him, rumors were spreading. Someone, probably Daniel, was telling people that the entire project was under investigation for mismanagement. That I'd funneled money through his company. The story snowballed. Investors pulled back. Journalists started calling. When the press finally ran the headline ***, young architect under scrutiny for fraud, ***, my entire body went cold. It didn't matter that I was innocent. The story was too convenient, too dramatic. I was suddenly the villain in the very narrative I'd built from survival. Martha stood beside me as the board demanded explanations. I could see disappointment in their eyes, disappointment not in facts but in the simplicity of scandal. "I'll clear this," I told her. "I know you will," she said softly, but truth moves slower than gossip. We froze all company accounts while the investigation ran. I sold my car, my jewelry, anything I could to cover legal fees and keep the studio afloat. Every morning I'd wake to new messages, threats, pity, or silence. My mother called once, just once. "Your father says this is why we warned you," she whispered. "You flew too close to the Sunday." The line went dead before I could reply. When the authorities finally completed the audit, the truth surfaced. The missing funds had been transferred to shell accounts tied to Daniel's company. He'd siphoned money under my credentials, leaving traces that pointed to me until they didn't. When the investigators confronted him, he claimed ignorance, blamed his accountant, then vanished. Martha tried to comfort me. "We can rebuild. Once your name's cleared, we'll start again." But she was wrong. The damage was already done. Clients withdrew, partners grew distant, and within 6 months, Green and Hale closed its doors. Martha moved to Oregon to teach at a university. We promised to stay in touch, but distance has a way of erasing even good intentions. The day we packed up the office, I stood in the middle of the empty studio. The walls were bare except for that framed newspaper article from years ago, the one that had called me A Story of Resilience. I took it down, ran my fingers over the glass, and set it face down on the desk. Outside, the city was gray with rain. I walked home soaked through, too tired to care. My apartment felt smaller than ever. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of traffic below, the same way I once listened to the wind through the barn cracks when I was 17. For weeks, I disappeared. No calls, no friends, no work, just silence. I spent my days staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between breaths. Some nights, I'd dream of the farm, of my father's voice calling my name, of Daniel's laughter echoing in the kitchen. I'd wake up sweating, reaching for air that didn't feel real. When I finally checked the news again, I saw Daniel smiling in a photo at a charity event, his wife at his side, their child on his arm. The caption read, "Local entrepreneur expands housing company nationwide." My stomach turned. The house of cards he'd built was now his empire, and I was its buried foundation. One night, I walked to the river. It was cold and silent, the kind of night that made the world feel like glass, fragile, breakable. I stood by the railing, the city lights trembling on the water's surface. My reflection looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, weightless. I thought of every version of myself I had built and lost, each one dying a little quieter than the last. That's when the rain began, soft, steady, almost tender. I tilted my head back, letting it wash my face, my grief, my shame. There was no dramatic collapse, no scream, no cinematic moment of rescue. Just the quiet acceptance that everything I had trusted, family, work, love, had been stripped away. In the following days, I sold what little remained. My furniture, my art supplies, my clothes. I packed a single suitcase and took the first train out of the city. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay among the ghosts of my own ambition. When the train crossed the bridge over the river at dawn, the city behind me glowed faintly gold in the fog. I pressed my forehead to the glass, tears hot against my skin. I whispered into the hum of the tracks, "Let it all die." The train took me north, away from everything I had built. I rode until the sky turned pale and the landscape changed from city glass to rolling emptiness. I stepped off at a forgotten town whose name I can't remember now, just a cluster of old houses, a diner, and fields stretching toward nowhere. It smelled of cold earth and wood smoke. I rented a small room above the diner where travelers sometimes stayed for a night and never came back. The walls were thin, the floor creaked, and the single window faced an alley filled with rusted barrels and rain puddles. The woman who owned the place gave me a discount when she saw the look in my eyes, the kind of look that says, "I've lost more than I can explain." Days blurred. I didn't work. I barely spoke. I lived on instant coffee and stale bread, wrapped in my old coat like a shell. The locals didn't ask questions. They'd seen too many people come here trying to disappear. I'd walk down to the river each morning, watching the frost melt on the stones, the sunlight too fragile to warm anything. At night, I'd sit on the bed with my sketchbook open, staring at the blank pages. My hands trembled every time I tried to draw. The pencil felt heavier than it ever had before. All the shapes I used to build the arches, the light, the symmetry had turned into ghosts. My mind was a ruin, stripped of color and purpose. Weeks passed. One morning, I woke to find snow outside. The whole world looked muted, covered in silence. Something about it felt both cruel and comforting. I put on my coat and walked into town. The streets were empty except for a stray dog trailing behind me, ribs showing through its matted fur. I shared my breakfast with it, and it followed me home. I named it Rusty, after the color of his coat. For days, he was my only companion. One evening, the power went out. The whole building fell into darkness. I lit a candle and sat by the window, watching the snowdrift under the streetlight. In the flicker of the flame, the walls of my room began to look like the inside of a cathedral, cracked, imperfect, but holy in its quiet endurance. And I thought, maybe this is what creation really is. Not the glossy perfection I once chased, but the persistence to keep breathing in ruins. That night, I opened my sketchbook again. This time, I didn't try to draw buildings. I drew lines that didn't obey rules, raw, uneven, alive. I drew what pain felt like, the sound of silence, the shape of grief, the shadow of betrayal. I filled every page until dawn. By the time the candle burned out, I was crying, but not from despair, from release. In the morning, I took my sketches to the diner downstairs. The owner, a woman named June, looked through them while refilling my coffee. "You made these?" she asked. I nodded, unsure how to explain what they were. She smiled, slow and genuine. "They're haunting. You ever think of showing them?" I shook my head. She wiped her hands on her apron. "You should. There's a little art fair next weekend. Not much, but people come from the nearby towns. You might sell one or two." I almost said no. The idea of being seen again terrified me, but something inside me whispered, "Try once more." So I did. I pinned my drawings on a borrowed easel at the fair. It was cold, and the wind kept tugging at the paper. Most people walked by without looking, but near the end of the day, a man stopped. He studied the drawings for a long time, his brow furrowed. Then he said, "There's pain in these, real pain. I run a small gallery in the city. You should call me." He handed me his card and left before I could thank him. That night, I sat in my room, card in hand, Rusty sleeping by my feet. The words on the card were simple: Elliot Kane, curator, Northview Gallery. I didn't know if I was ready to return to the city, but the thought of creation, of being alive in art again, made my heart beat for the first time in months. I called him the next morning. He remembered my name. "I don't usually do this," he said, "but your work feels honest. Bring what you have." I went back to the city 2 days later, wearing the same coat, carrying the same worn portfolio. The skyline looked different now, less like ambition, more like memory. I walked into Elliot's gallery, a small but luminous space tucked between a cafe and a bookstore. He greeted me with a quiet smile and asked to see my drawings. He studied them silently, one by one. When he finished, he said, "They tell a story without words. You've been through something, haven't you?" I didn't answer. He didn't need me to. "I want to exhibit them," he said simply. "We'll call it Fragments of Silence." The exhibition opened 2 months later. I expected no one to come. But the gallery filled writers, students, strangers. People stood before my drawings for long minutes, whispering. Some cried. Some smiled softly. I watched them from a corner, heart pounding, realizing that the ruins I had drawn were not just mine anymore. They belonged to everyone who had ever been broken and tried to rebuild. That night, Elliot found me standing alone after the crowd had gone. "You turned your pain into architecture," he said quietly. "Not of buildings, but of emotion." For the first time in years, I felt seen, not for what I'd lost, but for what I had created from loss. In the following months, the exhibition drew more attention than I ever expected. A magazine interviewed me, calling me the artist who paints with silence. The phrase stayed with me. It was strange, poetic, and true. Slowly, I began to rebuild not in architecture this time, but in art. I used charcoal, ink, metal scraps, anything I could find. Elliot introduced me to other artists, and for the first time, I felt part of something that didn't require validation from the people who had once broken me. Yet, even as I healed, one thought lingered like a quiet ember. Daniel was thriving somewhere, still living off deceit. My parents still believed his version of the story. I had forgiven them once, and it had cost me everything. I knew now that forgiveness without truth is just surrender. One evening, I sat by the window of my small new studio, Rusty sleeping beside me, city lights flickering in the distance. I took a deep breath and said to the empty room, "This time I'll build something they can't touch." And in that whisper, something inside me shifted. The despair that had once consumed me became fuel. The silence that had haunted me became focus. The girl who had once begged for love was gone. In her place was a woman who would rise not to be seen by them, but to remind herself that survival is an art form too. Success came back to me in whispers, not applause. It began with small commissions, portraits, installations, design collaborations, and spread through quiet word of mouth. My art no longer spoke of ambition, but of rebirth, and people listened. I stopped chasing recognition and started creating what felt necessary. That's when it found me again, recognition, this time without the hunger. By the time I turned 35, I owned a modest studio downtown, sunlight spilling through high windows onto canvases streaked with rust, glass, and ash. The Fragments of Silence series had toured across 3 states. I was earning enough to live without fear. But my past hadn't vanished. It lingered in the shadows of every interview, every introduction. "Weren't you once accused of fraud?" people whispered. "Didn't your brother clear your name?" The lie had aged well. Daniel's version of history had become folklore. He was now the proud owner of Hale Construction, expanding his empire into luxury housing. Newspapers called him a family man with vision. Every article about him burned like a brand against my skin. For years, I said nothing. Silence had protected me once. It had also suffocated me. But now, I had something stronger than silence. I had proof. While sorting old sketches one afternoon, I found a box I'd nearly forgotten, documents from the Green and Hale project. Among them was an old backup drive. I plugged it into my computer, half out of nostalgia, half curiosity. Inside were old contracts, scanned bank receipts, correspondence logs, and buried deep in a hidden folder, emails Daniel had forwarded to himself from my company account. Proof of forged invoices, falsified approvals, and signatures that no one but I could identify as fake. My hands went still. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was all there, the rot beneath his success. Every lie he'd told the world rested quietly in that drive, waiting. Revenge is a patient art. I didn't act right away. I waited. I watched. I studied the empire he'd built and the image he'd sold. Daniel had started a foundation, Hale Homes for Families, donating to rebuild low-income housing projects. The irony was so sharp it made me smile. I began to plan. First, I reached out to Elliot, the gallery curator who had once believed in me when I was invisible. I told him I wanted to create a new exhibition, something bolder, more architectural. "What's the theme?" he asked. "Truth," I said simply. "Buried truth." For months, I worked in near silence. I reconstructed the blueprints of the housing complex Daniel had stolen from me years ago, the one that had destroyed my career. But this time, I didn't draw walls or windows. I drew fractures, lines that bent and split, revealing veins of gold leaf beneath cracked surfaces. Each piece was an interpretation of deceit masked as beauty. I called the collection, "The Foundation Lies." The exhibition launched in spring. It drew enormous attention, not just from the art world but from the press. Reporters who had once written me off as scandal now called me the architect who paints betrayal. The symbolism was too strong to ignore. The series sold out before opening night ended. Among the buyers were corporate collectors and, as fate would have it, Daniel himself. He arrived at the opening unannounced, flanked by photographers and local press. I watched from across the room as he walked through the gallery, champagne in hand, pretending he was there out of curiosity. He stopped before a massive canvas depicting a skeletal building crumbling under its own weight, the foundation bleeding gold through black fractures. He turned to Elliot, who stood beside him. "Impressive piece," Daniel said. "It's almost familiar." Elliot smiled thinly. "It should be. The artist built it from real blueprints, ones that were stolen. Daniel froze for a fraction of a second, his smile faltering, but cameras flashed, and he recovered. Art, he said smoothly, is open to interpretation. He left early that night, but I knew the unease would follow him. It was only the first tremor. 2 weeks later, I sent an anonymous package to several journalists, the same ones who had written about my scandal years ago. Inside were the emails, the forged invoices, the signatures, and one simple note. You told one side of the story, here's the other. The articles dropped like bombs. Headlines lit up screens across the city. Hale Construction under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. Revelations connect CEO to past corporate scandal. The same media that had once buried me now turned their cameras toward him. His foundation lost its sponsors. His investors withdrew. His wife, a woman who had once looked at me with pity, filed for separation within a month. My parents, who had paraded his success like a family crown, were suddenly silent. I didn't celebrate, not yet. Revenge, to me, was never about spectacle, it was about symmetry, the quiet balancing of a scale that had been crooked for too long. When the investigation deepened, Daniel tried to reach me. He called, left voicemails, sent messages through old acquaintances. I didn't respond. Finally, one evening, he appeared outside my studio. I saw him through the glass door, disheveled, thinner, his arrogance replaced by something brittle. He knocked once. I opened the door. "Eve," he said, voice hoarse. "We need to talk." I stepped aside. "Talk, then." He walked in, eyes darting around the studio. "You think this makes you better? You ruined me." I laughed softly. "You ruined yourself. I just stopped covering for you." He clenched his fists. "They'll destroy me. Everything I built. Everything you stole," I corrected. For a moment, he looked like our father, the same desperate anger hiding behind control. He lowered his voice. "You don't understand, Eve. I did it for the family. For us. You were too fragile back then." Ugh. I stepped closer until I could see the cracks in his mask. "You took my name, my work, my reputation, and now you want to call it family?" He looked at me, searching for softness, for the sister he'd once manipulated, but she wasn't there anymore. I handed him a copy of one of my sketches, The Foundation Lies. "Keep this," I said quietly, "so you remember what truth costs." Then I opened the door. "Goodbye, Daniel." He stood there for a moment, shaking slightly, before stepping out into the rain. The street swallowed him whole. Months later, the final verdict arrived. Daniel was convicted of fraud and banned from operating any construction company for life. His properties were seized. The empire he'd built on deceit collapsed overnight. My name, once stained, was cleared publicly. The same networks that had smeared me now called it a story of redemption. I didn't attend the hearings. I didn't need to. My revenge wasn't in the verdict. It was in the silence that followed, in knowing he'd finally heard the echoes of what he'd done. A year later, I bought the old family farm. It was run down, the fields overgrown, the house leaning on one side. But I didn't rebuild it the way it was. I transformed it. I turned the barn into an art studio, the kitchen into a gallery of memories, photos, sketches, fragments of the life I'd survived. I kept one chair at the table empty, a reminder of the girl who once sat there begging to be seen. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'd sit on the porch with Rusty sleeping beside me, the air heavy with the smell of pine and dusk. I'd hear a car slow at the gate, people stopping just long enough to look at the mansion that now stood where the farmhouse once did. And sometimes on rare days I'd see familiar faces in those cars. My parents. They never called ahead, never asked to visit. They just stood outside, staring up at the house their daughter built, the one they once said she'd never deserve. I never went out to greet them. I didn't need to. The gates stayed open. If they wanted to walk in, they could, but they never did. They just watched for a while, then drove away, swallowed by the same silence they'd once fed me. And that was enough. Because revenge, I learned, isn't destruction. It's revelation. It's making the truth so undeniable that even those who buried it must look it in the eye. And as I watched the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and crimson, I whispered to the wind, "You took everything from me once. I rebuilt it all without you." The mansion stood where the old farmhouse once rotted. Its white walls gleamed under the morning sun, windows tall and clean, reflecting the fields that had once watched me grow and break. I called it Hale House, not as an homage, but as reclamation. I took back the name that had once burned me. The air smelled of rain and lavender. Wind brushed through the trees, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. From my balcony, I could see everything I'd rebuilt: the winding driveway, the pond where the barn used to stand, and beyond it, the wild grass my father had once cursed for growing too freely. Now it grew without permission, and so did I. Inside, the halls were filled with my art fragments of the past, reimagined in steel and glass. There were no family portraits, no photographs of smiling faces pretending at love. Just silence, shape, and light. Every piece I'd created since my fall found a place here, each one a reminder of what pain could become when transformed instead of buried. That morning, I was preparing for the Foundation Gala, the first event hosted under my name. The Evelyn Hale Foundation for Independent Artists. What had begun as one woman's survival had turned into a haven for hundreds of others creators who had been dismissed, silenced, or betrayed by those they trusted. Each of them carried a story like mine, written in invisible scars. And tonight, they would gather here, not as victims, but as architects of their own freedom. As staff moved through the house, arranging lights and flowers, I stood before the tall mirror in my dressing room. My reflection looked older now, not hardened, but shaped like marble that had weathered storms and still stood proud. The woman in the mirror had her scars, but she also had her peace. I thought of Martha Green then, her soft voice, her faith in me when I was nothing. I'd invited her to the gala. She'd written back, "I knew you'd build something sacred." Her words echoed through me like prayer. When evening fell, the estate glowed in warm gold, the kind of light I used to chase in my dreams. Guests arrived in sleek cars, laughter spilling into the air, music drifting like smoke. I moved among them with calm ease, not as someone showing off, but as someone finally home. Halfway through the evening, as speeches began, a quiet stir rippled through the crowd near the entrance. I turned, and there they were. My parents. They stood together, uncertain, out of place among the guests in tailored suits. My father's once imposing frame seemed smaller now. My mother's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for the version of me they'd last seen, the 17-year-old who begged them not to send her away. They found instead a woman wrapped in poise and silence, untouchable as moonlight. For a long moment neither of us moved. Then I nodded toward the attendants. The doors opened wider. They hesitated, then stepped inside. The music softened as I walked toward them. Every step felt like walking through time, across every scar, every silence, every night I'd cried alone. When I reached them, my father tried to speak first. "You've done well," he said, his voice rough. My mother forced a smile. "It's beautiful, Evelyn. We're proud." I studied them, the parents who had once turned their backs as I stood in the snow with a single suitcase. The man who had stolen from me. The woman who had chosen silence over love. I felt no anger, only distance, like watching a storm long after it's passed, when all that's left is the memory of thunder. "Thank you for coming," I said quietly. "The staff will find you seats." My father blinked, uncertain whether to feel welcome or dismissed. My mother reached out as if to touch my arm, then stopped herself. I turned away, not out of cruelty, but because forgiveness had already been given in another form in the life I'd built without them. Later, as the evening deepened, I stood on the balcony overlooking the crowd. The lights from below shimmered against the glass walls, painting the night in gold and amber. Music rose from the grand piano in the hall, a slow, haunting melody that reminded me of the wind across the fields when I was a child. I closed my eyes and breathed. The years unfolded behind my eyelids, the dinner table heavy with silence, the train leaving the city, the snow outside the diner, the gallery lights, the revenge, the reckoning. Every fragment had led here, to this stillness that asked for nothing more. When I opened my eyes, I saw them, my parents, standing at the edge of the garden, gazing up at the house. They didn't speak to anyone. They didn't need to. They stood in quiet recognition of what they had lost. Not money, not status, but me. And I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not pity, but clarity. The distance between us was no longer a wound. It was peace. Elliot joined me on the balcony, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "You did it," he said softly. I smiled. "No," I said. "I just stopped letting them define what it meant." We toasted, the glasses chiming like distant bells. Below, laughter echoed, the sound of lives no longer bound by fear. When the night grew quiet and the guests began to leave, I walked alone through the empty halls. The air was thick with the scent of candles and rain. I paused by one of my paintings, the last piece I'd finished before tonight. It was called Inheritance. In it, a young girl stood before a crumbling farmhouse, her shadow stretching toward a mansion rising from the ruins. Above her, the sky glowed gold. The girl's face was turned away toward the future, not the past. I stood there for a long time, letting the image sink into me, until I whispered aloud the only truth that still mattered. The sweetest revenge was not in their ruin, but in the life I built without them. Outside, dawn began to creep over the fields. The light was soft and forgiving, brushing against the walls like an old friend. I opened the doors, stepped barefoot onto the balcony, and let the morning air wrap around me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't haunted by where I came from. I was grounded in where I stood in the house built by my own hands, with no ghosts left to appease. The sun rose fully, spilling light through every window, catching on the glass, on the art, on my skin. And for the first time, I smiled not for anyone watching, not for memory or pride, but for the simple, undeniable truth of survival. I was home. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life.